Shunned by the West, Moscow goes east. President Vladimir Putin was in North Korea and Vietnam this week, strengthening old alliances as his war in Ukraine drags on. But what do both sides stand to gain? And what does the US think? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has wrapped up a two-nation Asia tour on a high. It was the first time in 24 years he'd set foot in North Korea, and he left Pyongyang with a new defence pact to show for it. His two-day visit to Vietnam also yielded several new trade agreements with the manufacturing hub. Putin's latest state visit seemed to be an attempt to bolster support amid increasing isolation over his war in Ukraine. But what do these countries stand to gain from closer ties with Moscow? And how is Washington reacting to it all? Before we go to our panel of guests to get some answers, this report from Michael Apple.
North Korea gave one of its closest allies a hero's welcome. Vladimir Putin was treated to all the pomp and pageantry Pyongyang could pull off. It's been 24 years since his last visit. Stronger ties between North Korea, which is almost entirely isolated, and Russia, increasingly so since it invaded Ukraine, mean the two leaders are committed to a lot more sharing. A new defense pact includes a clause that will see one come to the aid of the other in the event of an attack. And crucially,
Russia does not rule out the development of military technical cooperation with North Korea in accordance with the document signed today.
It was this comment that caused concern in the US. Two senators unveiling a bill that, if passed,
this picture says it all.
Would see Russia declared a state sponsor of terrorism.
I don't even need to go into the classified briefings that we've received to tell you how frightening the idea is that Russia would be lending its nuclear expertise to North Korea.
Next stop for Putin was Vietnam, a country he last visited in 2017. The two nations have struck nearly a dozen deals, increasing cooperation in industries from nuclear energy to education. Vietnam's trade with Russia stood at $3.5 billion 2 years ago, a fraction of the $120+ billion it does with the US annually. One analyst says its so-called bamboo diplomacy, which is strong yet flexible, shows Washington the world is no longer unipolar.
Countries are going to have multiple relationships. They're not going to be only on the US side or only on the Russian side. And that requires a shift and adjustment in the way in which the United States deals with many of these allies and many of these partners.
Putin returns to Moscow, having strengthened old ties and bolstered trade relations. Important steps in his effort to end Russia's growing international isolation. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. And from Seoul, we're joined by Andrei Lankov, a professor at Kookmin University and director of NK News. That's an online news source focused on North Korea. Benjamin Young is in Richmond, Virginia. He's an assistant professor at the Virginia Commonwealth University and author of the book Guns, Guerrillas and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. And in Canberra is Carlisle Thayer, Professor Emeritus at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, and a former senior staff member at the Asia Pacific Centre for Security Studies at the US Pacific Command. A very warm welcome to all of you. Andrei, this is Putin's first visit to North Korea in 24 years. Why is he making it now?
Because he wanted to exercise pressure on the United States. There are a few reasons, but the major message is something like, if the Americans are too active and too persistent with supporting Ukraine, Russia will revenge by supporting some countries Americans strongly dislike, and countries which are, at least in theory, dangerous for the American interests. And definitely North Korea comes first at this list. So it was just a show of defiance, if you like, and also a way to show that Russia is not isolated, or at least it can find some pretty dangerous allies. It was the major message. And also a way to pressure South Korea to make sure that South Koreans will not sell munition to Ukraine, because South Korea is one of the world's largest producer of munition, and it's vital for the Russian military efforts to block Ukraine from getting access to the South Korean shells.
Okay. Benjamin, let's bring you in at this point, because is that the message that the US heard from Putin's visit to Pyongyang?
The U.S. government is extremely concerned about this rejuvenation of Russian ties with North Korea. In many respects, this is revitalization of a 1961 treaty between the Soviet Union and North Korea, which assured both sides that they would come to each other's defense in the case of armed aggression. There's quite a bit of ambiguity in this renewed defense pact between Russia and North Korea. And I think that in general, the U.S. is quite limited when it comes to getting in the way of this relationship due to the geopolitical environment that the U.S. is now situated in.
Carl, let's bring you in because you are focused on Vietnam. This is not a pariah state, but it was in the same trip that Putin made to North Korea. Was it happy to be lumped in with such a pariah nation?
No, in fact, we now know from retired diplomats who are well informed in Hanoi that Vietnam tried to delink the two. And I think when we look at the joint statement, we can see, well, they had to grin and bear it, that Putin was going to go to North Korea, and that would have repercussions for Vietnam. But to craft a joint statement that tried to distance yourself from the bellicose rhetoric that came out of Pyongyang.
What impact did it have on Putin's standing, though? If the whole trip was designed to show the West that Putin is not isolated, to what extent did the Hanoi visit support his legitimacy?
Well, one, you have to understand historically, the Soviet Union recognized Vietnam in 1950, so it's a long-standing relationship. They had little hiccups after the Soviet Union collapsed. But in 2012, Russia Federation became a comprehensive strategic partner, the highest level in Vietnam's foreign policy hierarchy, along with China and India. There are tens of thousands of Vietnamese who studied and received education in that country. The whole military complex in Vietnam is based on Russian weaponry, technology, and equipment. And without it, it wouldn't be a modern force. And that's Kila-class submarines, guided missile frigates. The population has a great deal of affection because the Soviet Union helped Vietnam air defenses during the American War, as they call it. So they have a completely different perception of Russia than we in the West.
OK. Andrei, let's look at this mutual defence treaty that was signed between Pyongyang and Russia. It's a commitment to come to each other's aid in the event of an attack. But to what? There's very few details in it. To what extent does it involve perhaps military assistance in the event of an attack?
It's explicit that military assistance is likely to be involved.
And what does that mean?
Essentially, it's a revival. It's a revival of the clause which existed in the treaty signed in 1961 and was removed from the treaty in 1996 and now put back. So it's a return to the situation which existed during the Cold War.
And so does that mean, Andrei, that North Korea is providing Russia with weapons, as many reports say that it is, but of course it and Russia itself deny?
I have very little doubt it does provide with weapons, but it has nothing to do with the treaty. because from the North Korean point of view, it's a normal commercial activity. Yes, it's banned by the UN Security Council resolution, but North Koreans are quite certain that they are not going to respect and honor and follow these resolutions. So it's a kind of traditional cash. You send your goods. In this case, your merchandise is artillery shells, and you get your cash. It's sort of unrelated to any treaty. So for North Korea, it's a kind of symbolic gesture. They don't really need Russian nuclear umbrella because they have their own nuclear umbrella, as Putin himself recently said. And in case if they attack South Korea, which is not impossible in the long in the long run, well, I don't think that Russia will necessarily support them. Because there are many ways to get around, especially if some conflict is started unilaterally. Okay. It's more kind of symbolism and way to pressure Americans. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Benjamin, if Pyongyang is not looking to Moscow for support militarily, especially when it comes to a nuclear umbrella, as Andrei mentioned, how might it be seeking other expertise and technologies from Russia? For example, is it likely to be getting nuclear technological expertise from Moscow?
Quite a few of the reports that have come out in the public domain indicate that Russia has sent food aid, and there is also some doubts amongst experts whether Russia has sent technical experts to help North Korea with their space technology program, which has dual use capability for its military as well. And if you actually read this treaty that was just signed between Russia and the DPRK, it's not just about defense. There's also quite a bit of provisions within it about cultural exchange, about sending Russian students to the DPRK for language and vice versa, sending North Korean students to Russia for language training. This is really a deep social and cultural and political and military agreement between the two. This is the deepening of ties. And in many respects, this is also North Korea trying to reduce its near total political and economic dependence on Beijing. North Korea sends something 80 to 90% of its external trade with China. That is huge. And North Korea has always prided itself on being self-reliant, self-sufficient, and to being so dependent on one country is not something that the officials and the policymakers in the North Korean leadership want to do. And so in many respects, the war in Ukraine has opened up a new pathway for North Korea to return to this more non-aligned diplomacy where it is firmly on its own pathway. It's not a Chinese puppet state or Chinese lackey, that it really does have agency and autonomy in how it conducts its foreign policy. And that way it can maintain equidistance between Moscow and Beijing.
Carl, to what extent is that also true for Vietnam? And when we look at China's reaction to this trip by Putin to these two Asian nations, is Beijing concerned that Moscow is getting involved, is treading on its patch?
Well, Vietnam since the late 80s has a policy of diversifying and multilateralizing its external relations. I mentioned before it has a three-tier hierarchy, and China and Russia and India were the first to be comprehensive strategic partners. The US, Japan, Australia, and South Korea were added in the last 2 years. There's an intermediate strategic partner level and a comprehensive at the bottom. That's 30 countries. So if we see it as a galaxy, Vietnam sees itself in the center. It doesn't want to be pushed into anyone's orbit. And Russia is extraordinarily important because it's a member of the UN Security Council. It's a powerful military state. It supports Vietnamese military. It's a counterweight to China and Vietnam. But at the same time, this is the only country in the world that within 1 year has received Xi Jinping, Joseph Biden, and Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, this is its famous bamboo diplomacy that we heard about in Michael's report there, friends with all, beholden to none. But How long can it keep that up before it starts upsetting its biggest trading partners, which isn't Russia, it's the US and the EU?
Well, the United States Assistant Secretary Daniel Crittenbeck just showed up in Hanoi, but just prior, on the 13th of June, before Putin came, the new president of Vietnam, the former Minister of Public Security, met Mark Napper, the American ambassador, and said, we're encouraging defense and security cooperation with you. A huge American IT delegation was there. The Comprehensive Strategic Partnership with the U.S. is all about innovation, science, technology, computer chips, electric vehicles, and then working on climate change, green energy, and the resources that Vietnam has. The U.S. motivation is really to get at China and help Vietnam on the South China Sea. But if we leave that aside, Vietnam has a policy of 4 no's: no military alliances, no foreign bases, no ganging up on a third country, and no first use of force.
To what extent, Benjamin, does the US have to pivot its ideas about the world order and accept that it is not simply a black and white situation where the world is countries are either for it or against it under any given circumstances, that it is indeed multipolar?
The U.S. is finding itself right now in a difficult geopolitical situation with the strengthening of this almost so-called axis between Tehran, Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow. And Russia's war in Ukraine has really enhanced this axis in a way. And so the U.S. is in a difficult situation. And in many respects, Vietnam stands as a cornerstone of trying to wean strategic partners off of economic dependence on China. And Vietnam also stands as a really important economic partner, both for the U.S. when it comes to nearshoring and reducing our supply networks into China, but also Vietnam is important for defense and security purposes with the situation in the South China Sea. So the U.S. Foreign policy has never been a big deal in domestic politics, but obviously there's 2 major crises happening in the world right now: Russia's war in Ukraine and the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this is definitely weighing on the minds of the Biden administration coming into November with the election. And Trump has definitely been a different kind of U.S. president when it comes to foreign policy. He had, in 2017, fire and fury with Kim Jong-un, and then the following year, he met Kim Jong-un on 2 separate occasions. And so one would have to believe if he does win in November, that there would be a very unique U.S. foreign policy going forward in regards to Russia and North Korea.
Andrei, that's an interesting point, isn't it? And to what extent does there need to be a new approach towards especially North Korea? The US has sort of let it go by and large for a large number of years now. The sanctions are clearly not working. Do they need a return, for example, to the 6-party talks of over a decade ago?
Yes. It was well over 10 years ago. But the question is, actually, under Donald Trump, Americans tried to negotiate some kind of agreement. Probably Donald Trump hoped that he would be able to persuade North Koreans to surrender their nuclear weapons, which is clearly not going to happen. And it's very difficult for the American decision makers to realize that North Korea is going to remain a nuclear power for the foreseeable future, and nothing can be done about it. And even if the decision makers understand it, it's next to impossible to explain it to the Congress, to the media, to the common public, who matter a lot in America, which is a democracy. So the American decision makers are very careful. They don't want to recognize North Korea as a nuclear power and start talking about nuclear arms control, which is basically would be a very rational decision, but they cannot do anything about its nuclear program. And I think the current Putin trip once again demonstrated that sanctions are dead. Russia is not going to support it, not going to honor sanctions, regulations, and so on. But frankly, even without this Russian U-turn, sanctions were not going to work because, well, we have seen it. Worst case scenario, sanctions can kill some poor farmers in remote provinces, sometimes because they undermine economy, but they have very little, if any, impact on their nuclear program.
Andrei, when Putin was in North Korea, he railed against the hegemony and the imperialism of the West. I mean, that's quite apt language when you're in Pyongyang. Was he merely playing to his audience? Would you think he really is seeking a new world order? And indeed, can he create a new world order at this stage?
I believe he can sincerely sees himself as a person who is, opening a new era in the world history, quite probably. Definitely a new era in the Russian history, for sure. And he wants to position himself and Russia, led by him, as a kind of the leader of what is usually called now the global South, forces which are not happy about Western domination. They have very different ideas, very different agendas, but they are united by their dislike of the current world system. And Russia would like to position itself as, a kind of leader of this movement, its voice and everything. Will it succeed? I'm not so sure, because most of these countries don't see Russia as a part of the global South. But it's seemingly what Putin wants. And such rhetoric works very well in Pyongyang. Even though, by the way, North Korean leaders are not about changing the world. They are quite indifferent to what is happening in the world. They just want to keep their country under their control and to make it powerful and, if possible, prosperous.
Carl, we've seen Putin visiting Saudi Arabia, the UAE last year. Of course, they have relations with Iran, other countries as well. Do you think he has gathered enough international support to defy Western sanctions and prolong the war on Ukraine?
No, I don't think he can accomplish that. There's too many countries that are opposed, but the sanctions are never going to work 100%. There's ways of evading them. And with Vietnam, they talked about ruble dom, the Vietnamese currency exchanges, to get out of the SWIFT system that has sanctioned Russia for currency transfers. But Vietnam was castigated by the U.S. for receiving Putin because they were receiving a person under the International Criminal Court's warrant, for example. But there's a limited group. If we look at those who abstain in the General Assembly, it's just under a quarter of nations are trying not to. That doesn't mean they're siding with Russia, but they don't want to get involved in the polarization that's occurring. If we look, the BRICS is slowly being expanded with its membership, and Vietnam sent a high-level official, and they're looking at membership along with other countries. And there's a group in Africa and obviously in the Middle East. So Russia's trying its best to break out of them, but all the analysis that I'm reading about the economic sanctions, they're hurting, but they're not gonna. It's not like a wrestling match where finally Russia's going to say uncle and give up.
Right. Okay, Benjamin, is there anything that the West can do about these strengthening alliances?
Well, one of the tactics that U.S. senators have put forth is putting Russia on the state sponsor of terrorism list. That's important largely for symbolic purposes, but also it has economic implications as well. So the state sponsors of terrorism list in the U.S. now currently has 4 countries, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. Of those 4 countries, Cuba, in my opinion, really should not be on the list. But North Korea, in my opinion, really should be on the list, and Russia should as well. This would send a message that if you strengthen this axis and you coordinate economic and military relations with Iran and North Korea, which are both threats to the international liberal order, then you will get placed on this list. And this has ramifications for the Russian economy, which is already under heavy sanctions, but this would basically deny any sort of interaction with U.S. financial institutions. Moreover, it would send a message to other rogue regimes in the broader geopolitical landscape that strengthening and trying to be part of this axis with Iran, Russia, and North Korea will make you into a pariah state, will make you into a so-called rogue regime. And in our very globalized, interconnected economic world, you do not want to be placed on this list because it has severe economic implications for your tourism industry, for your weapons industry, and for your broader economic future.
Andrei, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree that Russia should be placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list?
Frankly not. And I believe that there is something strange with all this list because, well, sometimes you can find countries which have not done anything with terrorism for many years, like North Korea. It's a very unpleasant, very brutal regime, highly repressive, keeps its population under control, which has probably no parallels worldwide or very few. But its last engagement with terrorist activity took place 40 years ago, a bit more, mid-1980s. Nothing since then. And there are many countries which were involved with this activity, but because they have good relations with the United States, they are not part of the list. So for me, it sounds like a kind of using some good sounding words to manipulate, to basically put nice labels, just to describe countries which have bad relations with the United States. And for me, I've always been skeptical about the list, including the presence of North Korea in this list. Once again, I have no illusions about North Korea. It's a country where very few people would voluntarily like to live. Nonetheless, it's not a part of terrorism, and last actions which can be described as terrorist were with some North Korean involvement happened, well, nearly half a century ago.
Okay, and there we must leave it today. Many thanks indeed for all our guests for joining us, Andrei Lankov, Benjamin Young and Carl Thayer. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.